Greetings, and welcome to the Future Trends Forum. This week we asked, how might we use the narrative practice of world building for post-secondary learning? Last Thursday, we hosted two experts on the topic, Rochester Institute of Technology Associate Professor Trent Hergenrader and Dr. Stephen Slota, authors of the new book, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, just out from MIT Press. We delved into how the many aspects of pedagogical world building actually work, including artifact creation, group work, support structures, disciplines, and a lot more. We looked into what students learn when they co-create a fictional world and what benefits they derive from the experience. One caveat, I recorded this from the Toronto Airport's lower level. I think Zoom noise cancellation did a good job of taking care of most ambient sounds, but I apologize for what snuck through. There'll be links to our guests' bios and their book in the show notes. As always, the comment box stands ready for your thoughts and questions. Enjoy.
Greetings to everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm really glad to see you here today. We have a fantastic pair of guests talking about a terrific subject, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Zoom's noise canceling feature is getting just terrific. I am right now surrounded with a PA system playing some really bland music. There are hordes of people going back and forth, dragging all kinds of devices. And if you can't hear any of that, fantastic. So today's session is all about world building. And to back up and explain a little bit about this, here in the forum, for more than 10 years, we've been talking about pedagogy. We've had all kinds of different folks who have come in with great ideas for everything from gaming to open education resources to using AI. Today's session is a little different. It's going to build on our work on gaming and play in education, but takes it in a different direction. It proceeds down the direction of genre writing, of science fiction and fantasy. It has the idea of collaboration between students and faculty to build out a world and to inhabit that for learning. How does this work? Why does this work? How can it be implemented? To talk about that, we have two wonderful guests. I want to first introduce Trent Hergenrader, coming to us from RIT. Trent, where have we found you today? Is that your home office or your office?
This is my office. It's dreary. We've had some sunlight the last couple of days, but it is dreary today here in Rochester.
Well, I'm sorry that it's dreary, but I know you brighten up the place with your customary charm and happiness. Trent, by the way, all of you, I've sent you his bio. He may be, I think, the second published science fiction and horror writer on the forum so far. I'm really glad to host you. Trent, on the forum, we have a tradition of asking people to introduce themselves in a peculiar way. We like to know what you're planning on doing for the next year. So what are the projects and the ideas that are uppermost in mind?
So the big two projects that I've got working on, one is really just sort of the idea stage, is trying to see if we can work with some folks in the College of Art, Design, and Computing to start building a sort of a fictional layer in AR over the campus. So like making a steampunk RIT or a cyberpunk RIT that would have different kinds of locative narratives. So, you walk past a dorm and you get a little buzz on your phone, and then there's a little interactive fiction for you to do or something like that. So that's the very beginning. The thing that's a little bit further along, I've got about 250, 300 tabletop role-playing games and storytelling games in the library. And we're going to be doing we don't know how often yet, but it's either going to be a monthly or a weekly game night in the library where we pick a game and then students can come check them out. We'll play them, and then we'll talk about sort of the affordances, limitations, what those games did for them. Lots of gamers here on RIT's campus, and for the tabletop, they play overwhelmingly D&D, and one of my goals is to get them to try different systems, different games, and just think about how different kind of games tell different kind of stories.
Wow. I've got to say, you just made my day with that AR layer. I've been dreaming about that since around 2000, and I would love to see that go forward. And the game night is, of course, wonderful. What are you teaching this year? What are some of your classes?
So the classes that I'm teaching this semester is my world building workshop, which is something that I've taught probably more than anything else on heavy rotation. And then I took a group of 9 students to Spain during the winter break.
Nice.
And we went to Andalusia and learned about the history and culture of Al-Andalus when the Muslims owned most of Spain throughout the medieval era. And then we come home and we're working on a semester-long world building project where we use that as a basis for their fictional world. So it's sort of a medieval world. They've introduced some alchemy,
Yeah.
and some other speculative elements. But basically, it's trying to take the experience that they sort of physically moved through in Spain, and then trying to create histories and cultures that reflect what we saw in Spain.
Oh, it sounds amazing. And they've been capturing all kinds of media there, right? They're taking photos and video, which they can.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Well, let's put Trent here on stage, but next to him is his colleague and co-conspirator, Stephen Slaughter. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, Brian.
Where are you today?
It is also dreary here in central Connecticut. Trent and I live about 4.5 hours away from one another, but it seems like our similarly, I'm going to say realist attitude about reality right now has permeated the weather as well. So a little bit cloudy, a little bit drizzly, but otherwise not too bad.
Well, I'm glad to see you. And I remember some of that Connecticut gloom. But again, as always, your brilliance will help combat that, I think, pretty well. Let me ask you then, what are you working on for the next year? What's ahead for you?
So, as you may or may not know, those of you in the audience, I am no longer in an institution of higher education. I'm currently in my day job working for CVS Health, the national healthcare company. So I'm not here officially in that capacity, but I'll share with you that throughout our next year or so, we're focused on trying to integrate a new narrative arc to the training that we're doing for Quorum, which is the infusion and enteral therapy component of CVS Health. So if you know anything about infusion or enteral therapy, that's essentially getting an IV at home or getting a nutrition tube inserted, something along those lines. We help train the revenue cycle or finance division of that portion of the company. And in addition to that, developing a learning journey for it. We're also working on spreading the word, the good word of world building as a part of the storytelling apparatus within the organization. So I have a few presentations, workshops lined up for the finance community within the organization to teach some accountants how to tell better stories, in addition to helping the nursing staff start to understand a little bit more clearly the complex systems in which they are operating. So that's sort of the day job side of it. And then the after hours side of my life, I'm focused on with Trent, as you said, co-conspirator, trying to spread the good word of the book that we just published about world building and helping other educators understand how and why this is a thing they should try to implement in their own classroom environments.
Oh, fantastic. And by the way, it's great to see you in whatever housing you currently occupy. We host all kinds of guests from within academic institutions, from corporations, from the business world, from the nonprofit world, from companies, from governments. So we're definitely glad to see you. And in the chat, by the way, there's already people are nerding out about different game platforms. So it's good to see all of that right now. Well, friends, if you're new to the forum, the way we usually begin the conversation is, well, we just started, but I asked them a couple of basic questions to get things rolling. But then it'll be over to you for your questions and comments. So as Trent and Stephen describe what they're thinking, think about what you'd like to ask them. And of course, in thinking about gaming and world building and education, pedagogy and education, consider what questions you would like to have. So I just want to begin with one. I love this book. I mean, this as I told you both, and as I publicly said, this book did wonders for my mental health and for inspiration. I think it's a truly warm and thoughtful book that should inspire all kinds of instructors to all kinds of experimentation and exploration. Let me start on a practical note, though. What are some of the lessons you learned about practically implementing world building in a class? How do we structure that? How do we support that? I mean, is there a role for a teaching and learning center? Is this where the faculty member should take off? How do students help co-create the class experience like that? I mean, just practically, how do we do this?
Yeah, so I mean,
Right, why don't
I
you
would
take
say,
this first as the sort of we'll call you the grandfather of this book that we've written together. So I feel like you're the more appropriate respondent for this.
yeah. So the basically the idea is like we want to keep using the gaming metaphor. I always say when we're doing a project like world building, it's more like playing Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, in which you have a couple different books in which you get to make your own adventures, right? Where it's not like sitting down and you've got a strict list of rules that you need to go through. And I tell people that, and I do this with games as well, that you can do it for the entire semester. You could do one assignment. You could do a unit, right? Basically, you have to figure out, just like you do with games in education, you got to figure out what is the purpose of you doing a world building project in your class. And generally speaking, the thing that I always sort of start with is saying when we do world building, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about fictional worlds or modeling aspects of our world, that the world is all worlds are infinitely complex and you can never capture them in language or an image or anything like that. So when we're world building, what we're actually doing is taking a specific place in a specific time and trying to say, what's it like here on a daily basis, right? What are the social forces? Where do those come from? What's the society? What do they value? All these kinds of questions. And then once you get those social forces down, and this is where too, there could be some disagreement. And we look at Wikipedia as an example of how we say, well, some or most or all or few people believe this or that. So there's always sort of a countercurrent to the things that maybe the wider society accepts, but then, malcontents or other people may not go along with it or work against it. And then you start working through, populating the world with people, places, and things, with the people being sort of the most important in terms of demographics. Who is everybody in this world? We know that certain demographics have been written out of history for lots and lots and lots of years. And that's something that we want to address in this is if it doesn't matter if you are a street urchin or an emperor, you're both people living in this world at the same time. And the social forces are going to be very different for the two of you, right? The pressures, the demands of the world feel differently just based on who you are. And I think this is where something that Steve and I both, I mean, we both obviously are coming from a very specific kind of political end of the spectrum. But I think that this is where just sort of capturing what most reasonable people would say, this is what's going on in the world right now. And I would, look at something like what we're dealing with in our society with trans rights right now is you don't have to believe that trans people, deserve equality or, whatever it is, but you do need to accept that there are people who identify this way in the world. And I don't understand why, like that's sort of the first step is just accepting that people unlike you exist in the world and accounting for that. And then we can move on to the next question of what do we as a society want to do with these big questions, right? But at first you need to really just kind of agree that the world more or less works in this way. There are certain people who have more advantages. There are certain people who have disadvantages. It has been that way in virtually every society since the beginning of time. And before you can start doing any kind of problem solving, you just need to address, sort of the facts. This is what's going on in the world, and having that room for sort of different interpretations. No one has an objective truth as to how the world works. But this is why I always come back to Wikipedia as one of the models, where it's like that is a model in which lots and lots and lots of different subjective opinions sort of coalesce and create sort of something that most people can say, yeah, that's kind of what we agree that this topic, that's how we would talk about this topic. And there's plenty of room for disagreement in there. And that's where, just trying to get away from the binaries, there is right, there is wrong, there is truth, there is fiction, and trying to build a space for people to be able to start to ask each other, how do you think the world works, right? Rather than just assuming we all think the world works the same way. And that's where for educators, that would be the part where you get to invite in the students. You don't need to be the sage on the stage, the one who is telling them this is the way that the world works and these are the rules. You set up the scenario in which you say, well, how do you think this works, right? And then using primary sources and other materials to draw from, asking students to build out the world. And it also it's a great time to interrogate some of their assumptions about how the world works. And, is your room as diverse, is your classroom as diverse as the street 2 blocks down, right? These are all kind of questions that I think world building brings to the fore. And you get away from the question of woke politics. You get away from all of these other kind of questions where it's like, well, what do we just see when we look out the window, right? And let's just talk about it in language, right? And try and put words to some of these things that we're seeing.
If I can just piggyback off of that really quickly, and to get sort of the practical nuts and bolts of this, I came at this not as a creative writer like Trent, but as an instructional designer. My background is all in educational psychology and instructional design. And when we started working on this project together, he and I had both been utilizing world building for a number of years before even putting pen to paper. Metaphorically, it was all done digitally, of course, but that when we started this process of talking through what do we want to achieve by writing this book, it was essentially creating a template for any educator in any environment to be able to take these ideas that Trent is describing and implement them for higher education, for K through 12 education, for corporate training, for military or healthcare training. And in order to do that, you have to take this one-to-one ratio that we talk a lot about, the determination of what is your learning objective, and then mapping that to what is your activity objective. So if you're going to engage in world building as a pedagogy, you need to think very carefully about what do I hope to achieve by asking my learners to engage in the world building process, and use that as the foundation for figuring out what is my role in that process, depending on whether I'm an administrator trying to develop an entire program of study, or I'm an individual faculty member trying to implement this as a one-off activity in my classroom. So there are a range of possible ways to do this, and none of them are more right or wrong than the others. It all comes down to what is my instructional goal and what strategy can I use to achieve that goal, which I think can be a little intimidating for folks, especially if you don't have a background in curriculum design or activity development. But that's why the book is broken into multiple sections that each go into the nuts and bolts of how each part of the process works. So the first portion of the book is all about what is the learning theory that undergirds this? Why do we know that this works? And we tried really hard to focus on the research-driven elements of this that we can say definitively support it, as opposed to a lot of the sort of edutainment stuff that exists where there isn't necessarily a really strong theoretical or research-based foundation for it. We know based on good learning science that this can work because it's grounded in these big picture concepts of social constructivism, of andragogy or adult learning theory, in the hands-on kinds of instruction that happen in inquiry-based learning environments or anchored instruction environments. And again, it just circles us right back to that question of the one-to-one ratio between the learning objective and the activity objective. Am I reducing the barriers to transfer as much as possible through this process? And if so, how am I going to help orient my learners to identify the application of these ideas in the real world? Because as Trent said, like with his, I'm going to use his Spanish study abroad and then the world building project they're doing as an example here. They may be adding these sort of fantastical elements to that world, but what they're developing is grounded in reality. In the same way that when George R.R. Martin wrote A Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, he was grounding that in real history. And then he just played with the history and the War of Roses specifically, but he expanded upon that. He added these other layers that then asked these other interesting questions about how and why worlds work. And obviously he was working specifically as a response to Tolkien, and there's a lot we could go into with literary criticism about how and why that works. But from our perspective, we want to use the real world as a basis for helping other people understand not just the complex systems that surround us and that we interact with, but where they fit within those complex systems. What actionability is there for them to go out into the world and make a difference and change it to be more like they want it to be? And as we had frequently said on our own podcast about this book, we have a companion podcast where we do a chapter by chapter deep dive into each topic we discussed in the text. One of the things that we talk a lot about is that John Stewart phrase about how the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, except it doesn't just do that. Like, you actually have to bend it yourself. And so the question as a world builder is, how am I setting up a world where my learners, or I, as the person who's sort of shepherding this process, how are we going to think about our own actionability or our own agency to be able to make a difference in the actual lived reality we inhabit?
As I am utterly unsurprised, there's so much in what you both just said. And I mean, already in the chat, people are bouncing around in different directions. You mentioned Tolkien, so I recommended his classic essay on fairy stories, which explains his idea of world building.
Yeah.
Lee Mitchell says that they love the focus on actionability. And we've got some questions starting to pile up. I guess I have one follow-up question to all of this, and I hope everybody's minds are buzzing now about how they can do this. What are some of the worlds that your students and learners have been creating and co-creating? What are some of the examples?
Mine. So when I'm teaching my world building workshop, I teach two classes on heavy rotation. One is world building workshop, where we really kind of interrogate genre. Like if you're going to make a fantasy world, what kind of fantasy world, right? What kind of science fiction? What kind of sub aspects, subgenres are we sort of digging into? So it runs the gamut. I mean, there's a lot of cyberpunk, steampunk, high fantasy, sort of urban fantasy, right? There's every kind of genre that you can imagine. And one of the things, like Steve was just saying, one of the things that I have them do right off the bat is, if you're going to make a high fantasy like Tolkien-esque or Conan or whatever it is, I have them list everything from that genre that they recognize as being a marker, as like a trope of that genre. And then they have to take those and choose what is it that they're going to keep, what is it that they're definitely not going to do, and what is it that they may want to keep but turn on its head, like do something that they've never seen before, maybe bring in a second genre or something like that. And it's to get them to start thinking about, because otherwise, oftentimes, if you just let them go run, they just go to all the tropes, right? And it's like, well, we care about the stories about the people. So if it is, if there's technologies, if there's things, that's fine and great, but it doesn't really matter unless we know what it means to the people in that world. So it's a way of being able to say, like, hey, I write genre fiction, I write science fiction, I write fantasy, but those are just sort of metaphorical ways to get at the human condition. And that's what I want my students to be seeing too, especially the game designers, because they've got so many templates to be able to copy from that are just sort of surface level genre, right? And this is where, if we're going to be doing genre fiction, then it needs to sort of dig in. Another class that we've taught, I've taught a collaborative class before on steampunk Rochester, where we take Rochester in the 1920s and then they add steampunk technology that came out of World War I. And the whole question is, how does technology influence society, and what kind of technologies do societies produce, right? So it's sort of this back and forth with the idea that, yeah, it's whimsical, right, whatever, but we can also be looking at that with, say, AI, right? What is it that this technology is going to do for our society? What is it that we are doing to make this technology? So it's happening all the time, and I think sometimes the genre makes it a little bit, the genre element allows them some distance, I think, to sort of get their creative muscles working without worrying about having to be right or wrong. And then you can always kind of step in and say, like, hey, well, how do we think this would work in our world, right? It's like this world is fictional, but where do we see the overlap between the kind of structures, institutional structures, and, advantages or disadvantages that people have? Do we see some of those in the world? So I always use the example of, if you get pulled over by a cop, how do you act? And it's like, well, there are a lot of questions that go into that. It depends, like, what race are you? What gender are you? What time of day is it? What part of town are you in, right? Like those interactions, all of those things will change that scenario. Just the question, if you get pulled over by a cop, those change dramatically based on all of those four elements, and there's probably a whole bunch more. So then the question is, how many other kind of scenarios could we cycle through to sort of understand that we don't all experience the world the same way, and that's normal and okay, right? It's something that is existed for all time.
I think in addition,
please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've done this a few different ways, depending on which audience I'm working with, both in a corporate environment or an industry environment versus higher education. And the vast majority of folks I've done this with have been educators themselves. I was previously working as the administrator of the University of Connecticut's educational technology program. So I had a lot of graduate students who were themselves in-service educators working in K through 12 or instructional design. And the purpose of that experience for them was not driven toward creative writing so much as it was the practical, let's think through how would you do this in your own classroom based on your specific subject area. So if you're a social studies teacher, if you're a fourth grade teacher, if you're somebody teaching high school chemistry, it's going to look a lot different. And so we had a lot of diversity in terms of goal setting within the context of the world building project. Now, I also was a co-administrator of the game design program. And so I was working with a lot of students who were focused on both sort of the technical elements of game design, like programming, as well as folks who wanted to do interactive storytelling as their primary career focus. And one of the projects that I think I enjoyed most or found the most value in was actually the one that took place during the spring semester of 2020 when COVID happened. Not just because of the fact that the shutdown of the entire world served as a really useful vehicle to talk about these complex systems. For instance, a supply chain. How does that work? Why does it work the way that it does? How does it get impacted by something like a pandemic? There was a very practical reality to that that became very salient to the students that were participating in the world building experience at that time. But it also enabled us to do something really interesting, which was to take both of those separate groups, the in-service educators and the game design students, and have them build worlds in parallel to one another. And what I did sort of as a literary device, for lack of a better word, is we created a portal that connected those two worlds spatially and temporally. So one side of the portal was all the in-service educators. The other side of the portal was the game design students. And they didn't have direct contact with one another. They had a couple of people involved who were enrolled in both classes, who served as sort of messengers across the portal and could share selectively information that would transit between those two different worlds as they were being constructed. We ultimately called that project Polycosmia, which means many worlds. And the idea being that one side was one coherent universe developed by the game design students, whereas the other side was many different continents from shattered planets that all had their own cultures and politics and economic systems. And the real benefit here was that they got to know how one another thought about what a world is and why it's constructed the way it is and how it behaves. And as a result, all of those students came out of that semester, which I think fairly could be called chaotic and difficult for all of us. They came out with a much better understanding of how the world they were actually inhabiting worked. And as a consequence of that, we're better prepared to be able to go into the job market after COVID had happened and be able to talk intelligibly about why is it the world works the way that it does? And what can we do to make some of these systems more resilient in the future? How can we act in the world to make our economic and political and social and cultural systems more resilient as time goes on? So that, I think, was just the most acutely relevant version of this that I've implemented. There are others I've done that included fictional worlds. We've done an entire Tolkien themed one. We did an entire self-written, self-developed world that was built from scratch that had no precursor to it. So I've done this a bunch of different ways, but that specific one, I think, was the most targeted and relevant to the students who got to participate in it.
Oh, this is so rich between the two of you. You're describing just so many examples and so many ways that we can implement this. I just want to put a shout out to my colleague Wesson, who in my gaming class built a game teaching the player when not to call the police. So I'm delighted to see that. I have more questions, friends, but I want to turn this over to the audience who already has all kinds of questions. And we've got one from our dear friend Tom Hames, who wants to know, what do you think about using AI in world building?
Do we have another hour to talk about just this one question? It is, I mean, for me, it's one of the things that I always think when I'm talking about AI and thinking about AI specifically in terms of creative writing and fiction writing, and all these kind of things, is that AI is able to draw from, if you know how AI works, right? It is about word association and what is the most common thing. So if you're going to be using this to build a story, you're going to get the most common story, right? With a story structure that is recognized or whatever. And that may be good in terms of a story structure or whatever, but it's not going to be unique and good enough to get published, right? Like, this is where trying to get published, trying to get your work into the creative world and get paid for that work requires a lot of originality. So I think, in terms of using AI, I've done it before. So when I was teaching, there's sort of we were talking about Vasen, another role-playing game, which is it's Swedish folk horror, but we set it in Rochester. And I created 20 NPCs, in about 15 minutes that I said, these are people that you can interact with in this world. And they didn't need to be great, but that would have taken me forever to do on my own. So that's the kind of thing in which, for me, it was a great help to be able to say, or, just doing character modeling or something like that. But then sort of using that as the starting point rather than any kind of finishing point. And also kind of, one of the things that I worry about too is having, I went to a seminar on AI, and they said that they did this guy was saying he was part of a study where they had 20 students who used AI for sort of concept generation, just sort of like brainstorming, and then 20 who didn't. And the 20 who didn't came up with way more variety than the people who did. So that's one of the things, the people that were using AI. So that's one of the things that I worry about too, is that if you're using it for prompts, you may be unintentionally funneling, whereas, just the weirdness and the ideas that students come up with themselves, I want to sort of honor that and promote that and fertilize that as much as I possibly can. So I think it does have a role to play. But really thinking through the complexity, thinking about the things that the weird things that exist in our world, and you kind of have to wonder how they even happened. I don't think AI is well positioned to provide us that, and we shouldn't be asking it to do that, right? That's the human part that we're trying to bring to this. So I think it does probably have a role in filling in some of the blank spaces. But I would say, for me, the human creativity and the messiness. This is one of the things that I think Steve sort of mentioned is that it is messy by design. It's deliberately messy. It is, the students or whatever project you're working on is going to head in the direction that group working on it wants it to head, right? And that's where the real skill for the person leading it is making sure that that's always productive. You're never collapsing into sort of essentialist or, stereotypical, all people this way are like this, right? You want to make sure that that's not happening. And again, that's all very, not to sound Vulcan, but all very human, right? And that's something that we want to, I think, keep at the center of the world building process.
That's the social constructivist component, right? Like when we use Wikipedia as an exemplar, it's because we want our learners to engage in that process of, not necessarily agreeing on everything or finding, compromise on every single point. Like maybe they're going to have to dispute some of those things, or maybe some people think the world works one way versus another. I debated actually whether or not to sort of make this a current events style example, but what's happening right now in Iran is a really good example of how you can negotiate meaning. What does this mean for multiple different constituencies? How do the different factions involved in this think about the way that this might work? And so with respect to utilizing an LLM, yeah, it might be able to regurgitate some amount of information, maybe even some good information as part of that process if you write a sufficiently good prompt. But it's never going to do as Trent said, the messy part of getting people to debate or discuss what do they think is happening here and why do they think it's happening. There is no universally correct capital T truth that they're going to be able to get from either reading Wikipedia or going to an LLM. They're going to have to build that truth for themselves. And that's the part that I've always been most interested in about this, that it's not really about the end product. It's about what happens to get to the end product. And I said in our podcast many times, like, I don't really care if my students come out with one good wiki article about their project or many different wiki articles about their project. I want to see them engage in that good faith debate with one another about what's happening and why, because that's going to reveal for both themselves as in their own personal identities, as well as for each other, how do different people perceive and act in the world? How do they think about their own identity as related to these complex social systems? And what does it mean for the world they want to build that things operate this way? To get from point A to point B isn't as simple as flipping a light switch. You actually have to have a plan. And so if you want to, make the world different in some way, you kind of have to be able to say, here are all the contributing elements that cause the world to be this way. Here are the levers that are available to us to make change in these ways. And that may or may not be able to get us to these specific conclusions or goals that we're aiming for. And whether it's about the social construct of gender or the political construct of a nation state, like all of these things are negotiable in some way. It's just a question of how are we negotiating that and on what terms?
This is the ultimate social constructivist pedagogy, I think, in some ways. Thank you both. Tom, as always, thank you for the really solid question. We have a whole bunch of questions coming in, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask at least one. And again, friends, if you're new to the forum, this is how it works. When people put questions up and our guests have at it. Our good friend, the librarian Carolyn Crawford, says, she's curious, what are your thoughts around the work of Jeff Gomez and his concept of the collective journey, which is an opposition to the hero's journey?
I'm not familiar with it, but I'm excited about it. It's one of those things that, again, the hero's journey is something that I am working against in most of my fiction writing classes most of the time. It's useful as a model to be able to say this is how we can look at literature and look at stories, but it is very limiting, right? So this is one of the things as well, is that if you've got this, if you're playing, this is one of the things that I too think is interesting in the digital gaming realm. If you're playing a single player tabletop or single player role-playing game, generally speaking, you start off as anonymous and weak, and then you wind up being super, super powerful, and you are the most powerful person, right? But when we're playing co-op games, everybody can't do that, right? So everybody is advancing at their own rate, and maybe leveling up or whatever, but no one ever gets to be the person. And that's like our world, right? Like, no one has that linear progression to starting off being, an amateur, and then you have a linear progression to being the best or the top person. There's always tensions within that. There's always things that we're trying to improve. And again, that's one of the things that I'm trying to say. If we're build a world, which is what we in these classes, we build a world, and then we have 20 different protagonists telling their own stories, well, it just makes sense. They can't all be the most powerful, right? And it's not that interesting if they're like the superheroes, right, of that world as well. Like, even that, I guess we could probably play with a little bit, like The Boys does, and other kind of, questioning what superheroes are. But the point is that, you may have somebody who is a pauper or a street urchin. That's the character they want to play, and they're sitting next to somebody who is a billionaire philanthropist, and that's the character that they want to play. And again, it's this whole idea that the challenges that those two different characters face in the world are completely different, right? They're living in the same world, they're inhabiting the same space, but the way they would think about the world, the way that they would think about what it means to be a success or a failure is completely different between those two people. And again, if that is the model in a fiction class, well, when you walk outside, you should be able to look around and be like, wait a minute, isn't that the way that we're doing this right now, right? That everybody is kind of going through their own hero's journey in their own way, or their own journey in their own way, I should say, not hero's journey. But yeah, so that's, it's the old saying that, we're all PCs and everybody else is the NPC, right? That's true for everyone. And just trying to sort of, I think, stick to that. And remember too that in terms, I've not read this author's work, but I like that idea of collective journeying, because that's sort of the story with a semester-long project too, right? Like, people can claim parts of the world, but they could not have done that. Quite literally, could not have built the entire thing the same way without the contributions of everybody else in the classroom. So it is a collective project, and then within that collective, they get to find places that are, special to them or unique to them, or contributions that they made. So it's not just all a washout, that we're all just, clones or Borg or something like that. But we all, with our individuality, we can still collectively agree on things and move things forward, which again is a great metaphor for, I think, what we think society ought to be doing a little bit better job of, at least in the United States right now.
I like that very much, and this. So first of all, thank you for bringing up the collective journey. I'd like to follow up with that in many ways, and thank you, Trent, for that deep dive into this. I love the politics of this. We have a question that springs off of it, I think. This is one from our friend Shauna Pote, who says, beyond rooting world building pedagogy in the world today, it seems that its approach could also be applied similarly to scenario planning used by future scholars, except with narrative and play as the engine. Do you see collaborative world building as a way to help students practice thinking about possible futures rather than just fictional ones? And if so, Which social systems might you think most effective for teaching anticipatory thinking with this approach?
I can kind of cover this one. I just finished editing the podcast episode that we produced about simulations, and I think that's probably the biggest corollary here, that world building itself is mostly about defining the parameters of the system that you want to evaluate. It can be as narrow as the individual street corner in a city, or it could be as big as the entire planet. And you really have to just think through, what is it that we're trying to achieve by evaluating this specific world? Is there value in generalizing more or being more specific about the thing we're trying to do? And I think the goal that you want to set for yourself as you're developing this kind of project is to think through, what is it that I'm doing to tune people's attention to the world? Like, what is it about the world that I want them to understand and take away from this? So with respect to modeling future events or modeling potentialities, we would suggest creating that world and then using simulations to play around with the space and time of that world, moving forward or backward on the timeline, or expanding or contracting the geographic area to talk about how the world transitions. We often use the example of the American Revolution and the idea that it's not just the 13 colonies rebelling against Britain, right? Like the American Revolution was much more complicated than that. And you could go much further back than the Declaration of Independence to argue that the revolution started. Is it really the Enlightenment that started it? Is it the transition from the European continent to North America that started? Like, how do we think about the boundary constraints of a given world? And when we talk about simulations, what we're really saying is, put yourself in the shoes of somebody, sort of a third person distant point of view, to say, how is this world operating? And then drilling down to an individual level of an individual person and asking, what is this person doing within the constraints of that specific world? And what could they be doing differently if they wanted to change the world in some other actionable way? So we had this whole conversation about EMS, emergency medical services. You could use world building with a simulation activity to help people think through emergency planning. So we're modeling for a town. What happens if there's a toxic waste spill? How are we going to deploy resources to be able to accommodate all the different needs and constituencies affected by that? That's different than role playing within that world, where you might have somebody pretend that they're an actual EMS worker, like an ambulance driver who's going, "Oh, I'm here to help you, ma'am." Like, that's a very different kind of experience than somebody who's just simulating at this third person distant level what would happen or what could happen if we had the world set up this way and then pushed over the dominoes and watched them fall. So we very intentionally divided those chapters in the book so that they were separated between the world building process, the development of entries that define that world. So when we say entries, we mean like Wikipedia style articles where you have defined what important elements, groups, people, places, things exist in that world, and then using those various wiki articles as the basis for a simulation versus a role play, where somebody is either performing the analysis of a system versus evaluating the behavior of an individual person. So a simulation is about understanding systems, and a role play is about understanding people, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
I would add to
please
that
go ahead.
too. If I could just jump in, that this is one of the things that I'm trying to sort of do within the academy, is using world building as either a transdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary mode, that if you want to do interdisciplinary work, start with something where you just agree, like, if you're talking about how do we want to combat misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, right? Well, first build a world that you can see the problems, right, from no specific disciplinary angle, and then trade ideas of how your discipline would attack that problem, right? And this is where, because I think what we hear a lot, like in my institution, is they really, really push interdisciplinary projects and interdisciplinary research, but a lot of faculty weren't trained. I'm lucky because I was trained, in that way, but they don't know how to get started, right? And it's like, well, how do we even, the problem is this, and it's like, well, that's the problem as defined by a social scientist, or that's the problem as defined by an engineer. But if we, take a world and say overfishing or something like that, right? And look at it. It's got tons of dimensions. It's got the science dimensions. It's got the social dimensions, right? And it's got all these different forces. And all of those disciplines will be better off if they're thinking through all of those disciplines, right? Like even though that they may just have one little corner, but in order to better understand the problem, you have to understand the bigger system.
Oh, this is terrific. I mean, friends, if you haven't read this book, you can see why I was so excited to host these two talking about it, because thinking about world building and education pulls together so many different threads. In the chat, we have a whole series of questions, some of which have already been answered, and I'll make sure everyone gets a chance to ask. There's some questions, practical ones about time, and Brian Rockwell, the splendidly named Brian Rockwell, has a great question about doing this online, and Stephen answered really, really well about the technologies that he used. But I also do want to get Teresa Davis followed up, and I want to put two questions together. Teresa asks, I would like to add, are there any ideas for doing this kind of learning in a condensed course, short semester? So along with that, we have a question from Jude Jones, who asked about time management. What's the best strategy to start to frame a pedagogical incorporation of this approach that students can really accomplish in a semester? And Jude is talking about philosophy courses, but I think this applies to others as well. So thinking about time and practically doing this in a class.
Steve, you want to grab that?
Sure. So when we started developing these courses for ourselves, one of the things we found very early on is that it requires a lot of prep work. But the plus side of that is once you've done that prep work, a lot of that is then taken over by the students. Like once you put it in their hands, most of your job as a facilitator or an educator is to find the teachable moments or teach in the cracks where you find these students are having interesting discussions. And sometimes it's as straightforward as just walking around the room and saying, hey, what are you guys up to? Or, hey, what are you thinking about? Or asking them for more input on what specific topic they're debating. And the practical reality is that in a 14-week semester, and I'm just going to pick that number sort of as a standard, you probably are going to lose a couple of weeks on either end for things like introducing the course and then finishing the course. So you need to leave room for a debrief. Trent and I both are big believers in standards-based assessment as opposed to alphanumeric assessment. So really thinking about what can we do to set up rubrics that are going to help constrain student thinking so that when we get to the end of the semester, evaluation can be a back and forth between us and the learner so that they are telling us what they learned, not us just testing them with a standard or a standardized kind of assessment like a multiple choice test or an essay. And if you've done all that thinking about what it is that you want these learners to get out of the process, you can kind of strategically think through at what stage do you need to introduce each component of it. So for example, with the in-service educators I was talking about earlier, I would teach the first month of that course as just being, here are some foundational storytelling principles. Here are some foundational game design principles, so that when we got to the world building element of this in the second component or the second portion of 3, they would be able to understand some of the language that was necessary to have these conversations. They would then develop their own worlds. And then the final part of the course was them taking the worlds they had developed and implementing them for their own classrooms, figuring out what kinds of activities could I build out to make the most use of this specific world that we created. Now, again, this all comes back to that one-to-one principle of what is it that I want my students to get out of this class, and how can I align my objectives with those activities to make sure that we're reducing the barriers to transfer as much as possible. So when you're thinking about time management or planning, you really want to be deliberate and think through how much time would it realistically take for somebody to understand a foundational concept related to X or Y, and then make sure that's built into the curriculum you're developing. Now, I can fold this back into the other answer I had given about how big or small are these projects. You can do this in an afternoon, right? You can probably in an hour or 2 hours be able to do a successful world deconstruction, but that's probably going to be very targeted at a world that already exists that you're deconstructing and debating. Like if we read The Handmaid's Tale, then okay, we could just sit down and everybody pulls out this deck of substructures that we've created, and we talk about every substructure. What are the politics of this world? What are the economics and education and healthcare systems of this world? That's a little bit different and less time consuming than developing an entire world from scratch, which is where we would say you probably want to spend at least a month or 6 weeks starting to build out that world before you do anything with it. So again, thinking through how much time is afforded to me, what are the resources that are available to me, what kinds of limitations are my learners going to have, do they have other priorities they need to be worrying about, and just sort of doing some strategic instructional design to figure out where am I going to, implement this most effectively, how am I going to implement this most effectively. And that's why the chapter 3 of the book is all about just instructional design principles, because we really wanted to help people understand, if they've never done this before, what kinds of questions should you be asking yourself before you even get to the point where you're bringing this into the classroom.
Yeah, I would say too that one of the things is embrace the messiness of it. It's all process over product. And if you're having a really rich conversation and students are into it and they're getting into it, well, your project is what your project is. There's no one that's going to be, expecting you to have a perfect perfectly built world at the end of it. So that's one of the things. The thing that I worry about is that, and this is something that I think comes from sort of a capitalistic mentality, and also I have a problem with engineers with this quite a bit, is the urge to simplify in order to make something efficient, right? And this is something that I absolutely want to work against. And one of the things that we're talking about is we can talk about the world of the United States versus the world of China and make a lot of generalizations about how they are different and how they are similar, right? Sort of Venn diagram. But then the Northeast is very different than the Southwest United States, and the Northwest United States is different than the Southeast United States. So then you can compare those models, right? And then you can zoom in. Like I always say, oh, well, people from Wisconsin, where I'm from, they like to drink beer, eat cheese, and cheer for the Packers, right? Well, of course, there are people in Wisconsin who don't drink beer, who don't eat cheese, and don't care about football, right? But generally speaking, especially in Green Bay, right? You were going to be able to throw a stick down the street. You're probably going to hit somebody who follows that, or it sort of, matches that representation. But you want to avoid having the lesson be everybody in Wisconsin. Like we had to move through this too fast. So we're just going to believe that everybody from Wisconsin drinks beer, eats cheese, and loves the Packers, right? And that's going to be the stereotype because it's easy for us to remember that's what Wisconsinites are like. So that's one of the things that you do want to always be working against, is making it messy, making it not, this is always ways a great sell for the administrators. It's inefficient. It doesn't do great with, standardized results, standardized testing, right? Like your results are going to vary. It's kind of each student are going to learn different things. But unfortunately, that's what good learning is. So we don't really make too many, don't make too many apologies for it, right? It's like, that's just the way it works. And the students, get a ton out of it. And this is, to say too, I started my first world building class in 2011 and have been doing them pretty much ever since. So this is also not like we came up with this idea over the weekend and decided to kick out a book. This is the result of over a decade of both of us in different environments, exploring. And that's why I was really excited when MIT actually contacted me and said, hey, your collaborative world building for writers and gamers book is really cool. Have you thought about doing one that could be applied to the real world and bring in learning theory and whatever? And I said, yeah, of course, right? So that I sat down and I'm like, I don't think I know enough about learning theory to write about it intelligently. So why don't I, drop my best friend Steve here a line and say, hey, how about we write this together? Because the two of us have been doing this for a long time, right? And again, it's one of those things where just the act of collaboratively writing the book made it better, right? By being able to say like, oh, is that the way that you do that in your class? Because I've never done it that way. So that's just a nice sort of like meta commentary on sort of the process and how we've gotten here too.
Well, this is so exciting, and you can see my excitement reflected in everybody else in the chat going wild. There are more and more questions and comments. So first, thank you both for that most recent answer. Jude Jones mentions that they just came from a meeting on transdisciplinary research, and they're weaving together these two meetings, which is exciting, which is really great to see. Friends, we have about 4 minutes left. So I wanted to give you a couple more questions if we can sneak them in under the wire. Charles Finley wants to know this really good question: is the truth of the world based on consensus of the designers or scientific research, social science? I have a difficulty, he goes on, I've had a difficulty with simulations, not knowing how valid any of or the scoring or decisions were based on reliable and valid research.
One of the things that Trent and I have really emphasized in the book is that truth is in the eye of the beholder. And I think that's super evident. One of my hobby horses for the last 10, 15 years at this point has been mis and disinformation and the information economy, information ecosystem, how attention is used to persuade people or drive their behavior in certain ways. And when we talk about capital T, big truth, right? That's going to be defined by everybody involved in defining it. Like we all decide for ourselves what is true and what is not. And that is sort of a postmodernist kind of perspective, right? Like it's just that nothing is real and everything is real. It just depends on who you are and what your life experience is. And so Jude says, say some more about people's attention and driving behavior. I'm going to use the example that I think all of us are now familiar with, which is social media, right? Social media isn't just some neutral tool that gives you information about the world. Social media is a capitalistically driven vehicle for issuing certain kinds of proclamations about the world. And you can choose which part of the information ecosystem that you get your information from. Some people are really good stewards of that information. Some of them aren't. Some people are using it for manipulative purposes. Some aren't. Some, like Facebook, for example, go out of their way to turn the knobs to make sure certain kinds of emotional responses are more likely to occur than others. And that's not an accident, right? That happens on purpose.
Not neutral.
So yeah, it's not in any way neutral. And part of the reason why both of us, Trent and I, love Wikipedia is because it's closest to some kind of neutral representation of reality. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it always works. But if you can look at something like the Wikipedia page for Gamergate, which I think both of us agree is when a lot of these problems sort of started to emerge and it became incredibly visible online. The rules of Wikipedia more or less held through that. Like, yeah, you could go back and refresh the page every 15 minutes and it would look different depending on who last edited it. But as time wore on, you get this sort of consensus building agreement about what perspectives existed and which ones were considered sort of outliers versus the mainline consensus. That's really important. Like, and as a scientist, I really believe in the idea that the empirical methodologies we use to understand the world, both quantitative and qualitative, are really, really important for knowledge generation. But none of us has a monopoly on information or knowledge, and we all just kind of have to learn to get along and be able to understand that other people see things differently and then talk across those differences in some meaningful way and in good faith. Like this is, and I want to be really, really specific about that. Like this does not mean you entertain bad faith actors. And I think that's a really important facet of this that's lost when you look at, for instance, how corporate media behaves. Like they will platform people who engage in bad faith because it's good for ratings or it's good for making money or it's good for this, that, or the other thing. Whereas the institutions of science and knowledge generation have more or less some guardrails that try to prevent against that, but even they're not immune. And so we are constantly having to do this. It's always negotiated.
I was going to say, too, one of the things that Steve and I are both very, very aware of is that Wikipedia is overwhelmingly sort of managed and contributed to by white men, right, of a certain class, I would suggest as well. And that's the way that Wikipedia could be so much better. And they do have hackathons, and like let's have a group of women take a full day and just go through Wikipedia and make their own suggestions and edits and things like that. And I think that in a perfect world, that would be accessible to everybody of every age on every corner of the planet, right? To really get a consensus. Because I think what I would have to guess that Wikipedia is still sort of a Western white worldview. It's not, but it's also something that is there, that is a text that everybody can look at and contribute to, right? So it's at least in principle the best thing that we've got going at the moment, and it can always get better.
Speaking of going at the moment, that is a great high note upon which we must end, because we have just blasted past the 3 o'clock end of our session. And this is terrific. We could keep going on for a while, and you're giving me some inspiration for ways of doing different sessions of the forum around world building. Maybe we can follow up and do a world building workshop or a world building example.
That'd be great.
That would be awesome. Yeah. By the way, I just want to say, greetings to people who are new here. We saw Dr. Cheryl, who just joined us, so I'm glad to see you. But I have to wrap things up. Stephen, Trent, you've been fantastic. What's the best way that we keep up with you and your work?
Well, we have our own website for the book called theworldbuildingworkshop.com. And as I said earlier, we have a companion podcast that Trent and I have been recording and publishing to correspond with each chapter of the book. So if you've been interested in these topics, if you want more details about the practical implementation or tools you can use, or when to use simulations versus role play versus some other strategies, all of that is in the book, but it's also in the podcast, which you can get wherever you get your podcasts, free to download. It's also available for free on our website. And in addition to that, we have some resources on our website, including a free print and play version of the card deck that we use for our own world building projects. Nice. We have a number of different other opportunities for you to reach us through social media. We have a contact form on the website. So if you want to follow up, please feel free to shoot us a message, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about this subject.
Yeah, we both love to, like, people say, hey, look, I was thinking about doing it. It's like, let's sit down and let's talk about it, right? Like, we get really excited about it. So feel free to drop an email. I mean, both Steve and I get really engaged. And one of the things, I'm also the director for the Center for World Building and Storytelling here at RIT. And one of the goals that I have is to get this methodology out into the world. So, I am more than happy if you got a history class, if you got a philosophy class, we've got case studies from different disciplines on the website as well. And if you want some advice, more than happy. And I mean, we've been doing this long enough too that it's a quick consult is not anything that we would say no to. So,
well, that's fantastic. That's very, very generous. Both of you, Stephen, Trent, thank you so much for this great work and for being terrific guests for an hour. And for everybody else, thank you for the rich questions and comments. There's so much in here. I'm going to try to extract the chat as best I can and follow up with as many people because there's a lot going on there. Everybody else, we have sessions scheduled out right now through April, covering a wide range of topics. So if you haven't been to it, go to the forum website, forum.futureofeducation.us, and you can see what's coming up. I actually have to run and catch a plane right now, which is the world's least interesting simulation or game. But I want to thank everybody for a great hour of conversation. I hope everybody stays well, that if you're in the colder areas, that you're warm and dry. In a chaotic world, I hope we provided some comfort and support for you. Please be safe, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you next time online. Bye-bye.
Happy travels.